Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And well, I must say that I'm a kind of outsider since I'm not a scholar in Chinese studies, but in Japanese studies. And one of my fields of research is that of the culture of tea in Japan. So I've been invited today to speak about tea in Japan, and well, my subject, as you see in the screen, is the monk Eisai and the early history of tea from China to Japan, and well, also in Japan, the history of tea is a long history, a very complicated history, but I will try to see the first steps of the importation of tea from China to Japan. Since I am a Japanologist, we read everything in Japanese spelling, and but since I put inside characters, since you specialists are in Chinese language, you can read it in Chinese if you like. I'm not able to read them in Chinese. Well, the early introduction of tea, the very first sources about the introduction of tea into Japan are very scarce. We have scarce information about the early introduction of tea in Japan. Perhaps the first is a Buddhist monk called Gyoki, who lived in the between the 7th and the 8th century AD. The first certain reference to tea in Japan is in the year 727 Anno Domini, when an embassy from China brought tea to the Emperor Shomu. And after that, we know that the tea seedlings were successfully planted in the imperial gardens. It is believed that also the Tendai master Saicho, one of the greatest Buddhist masters of Japanese Buddhism, coming back from a journey in China, he went to China in order to study Buddhism on Mount Tiantai, brought back to Japan the seeds of tea in 815. He served tea drink to the Emperor Saga, and after that, Saicho planted tea seeds in the garden of the emperor. Here you can see an image of Saicho holding in his hands tea, probably tea seedlings, if I can see well. Now, in the Nihon Koki, an historical text written in the year 840 by Fujiwara no Otsugu, it's written that in the year 815, when the Emperor Saga went to the temple Bonshakuji, received from the monk Eichu a tea drinking. This is the very first reference to tea drinking in Japan. The Nihon Koki is an historical text which is very reliable, so we are sure that in the beginning of the 9th century, a few Japanese drank tea. Emperor Saga ordered that tea plants be cultivated in the capital, which was Kyoto at those times. Tea was even planted outside the precincts of the imperial palace. Now you can see here the passage of the Nihon Koki regarding this information about tree drinking by the Emperor Saga. Of course, it is written in Chinese language, so you can read it. And as it was usual for historical text, even in Japan. In red, I put red in a few keywords like, you see, here, this is Eichu, the monk Eichu, and this is, well, we read in Japanese, sencha, sencha. So it seems that the first tea drinking by the emperor was a kind of sencha. Then tea drinking, repeated many times, and then this is tea from the mountains, and so on. I translated the first part into English. It says, it is written that Emperor Saga on the 22nd day of the 4th month of the 815, going to the temple Sufukuji and the temple Bonshakuji. There the priest Eichu led many monks to greet the emperor, who got off on the palanquin and entered to the hall to worship the Buddha and composed a poem. Then the priest Eichu prepared with his hands sencha, tea, and offered it to the emperor. This is the oldest source of tea drinking in Japan, and so on and so on. It seems that Emperor Saga was very fond of drinking tea. And since he was also fond of poetry, he wrote poems in praise of tea, as the following poem, which has been translated into English. I took it from a translation by Dixon Morris. And this poem, which was originally in Chinese, says, long years have passed, yours in the way, mine in worldly life. I am fortunate to speak with you this autumn, drinking fragrant tea until late. Painful though the parting may be, I bow to you as I see you off to the distant clouds. In the first verse, when they say long years have passed, yours in the way, it means it is referred to the monks who are on the Buddhist way, of course. Mine in the worldly life, since he was the emperor, he was engaged in worldly life. And he speaks about drinking fragrant tea until late. By the way, the Emperor Saga was very fond of Chinese culture, so it's possible that drinking tea imitated Chinese culture. He was also very fond of Chinese manufactures, which he imported into Japan. In any case, tea was brought to Japan around that period by Buddhist monks who went to China for study. In the Chinese temples, tea drinking was largely spread. So the very beginning of tea in Japan is due to Buddhist monks and is strictly related to religion, especially to Buddhism. We will see that the first part of tea in Japan, covering the first 3-4 centuries, is always related to Buddhism. However, in this first phase of introduction, tea had little success except in temples. Tea was considered precious and expensive, and very few people could enjoy its drinking. When the Japanese monks went to China to study Buddhism, they learned that in Buddhist temples in China, they used to drink tea, especially in order to keep awake during the long meditation sessions. And so they learned that tea drinking was very beneficial for practicing Buddhism, and they introduced tea drinking together with sutras and books to Japan. But in this first period, tea drinking was very, very limited, actually. Very, very limited to aristocrats and only a few temples. Now, the second phase of the introduction of tea in Japan is that by Eisai. However, the effectual introduction of tea in Japan from China is due to the Zen monk Myoan Eisai in the 12th century. He resumed the contacts between Japan and the continent after a long period of interruption. Actually, after the 9th century, the exchanges between Japan and China were interrupted. They resumed in this period. So the monks went to China after a long period of interruption, and they found that tea was very popular in China. He came back to Japan in 1191, this time bringing back with him Zen scripture and tea seeds. Eisai gave a few seeds of the tea to the Shingon monk Myoe, who had founded a temple called Kozanji in the mountain around Kyoto. It is still there. I will show you a photograph later. In a place called Togano, launching the spread of tea cultivation throughout the country. This place, this temple and Togano, the place is very remote on the mountains. I went there this spring in March. I was in Kyoto and went there to see what is there in present day. At present, not far from the small temple where Myoe practiced Buddhism in the woods, there still is a tea cultivation. I found there a tea cultivation. It is still there since the times of Myoe. By the way, this is Eisai, the monk Eisai, a statue of monk Eisai. And this is Togano. As you see, this is the first cultivation, the most ancient cultivation of tea in Japan. It's like this, you see, it's very, let it as it is in a very natural way. Of course, cultivation of tea in Japan now are very, very different. This is not for production, actually. This is only just to leave it there because it's an historical site for tea. But this is the very first. And this is the small temple or building where the monk Myoe lived. And it's very, very near. It's 100 meters from the cultivation of tea. The introduction of tea by Eisai was accompanied by a book which Eisai wrote in Chinese language in order to present the beverage to the Japanese, mostly to the Buddhist monks and the court. This book is called, well, in Japanese we call it Kissa Yojo-ki, which is drinking tea for health. It is a kind of medical treatise that deals with the healthy properties of the drinking. It is written in Chinese since because Chinese was the language used for Buddhism and also for serious treatise and so on, just like late in Europe. We read in the historical record of Azuma Kagami that in Japan, Eisai used tea to cure the shogun Minamoto no Sanetomo, who could recover. In that period, the shogun, who is the most important person, was ill, and he went there and he cured him with tea, and he could recover. So the fame of tea spread very quickly all around Japan. Kissa Yojo-ki is a treatise based on the medical theory of the 5 elements of Chinese medicine, which associated 5 flavors, acid, pungent, bitter, sweet, and salty, to the 5 main organs of man's body: liver, lungs, heart, spleen, and kidneys. He says that the Japanese take little of the bitter taste because tea is considered to have a bitter taste. And this causes debilitation and disease. Eisai explains how to maintain balance among the organs of the body advocating the drinking of tea to that purpose. Eisai states that tea is a marvelous elixir of health that has a capacity to prolong human life. It grows in mountains and valleys, the sort of land where the spirits of the gods dwell. By the way, he was a Buddhist monk, and he speaks about the gods of the Shinto tradition, but you know. And it is a splendid medicine for this later degenerate age. It was considered the degenerate age in that period. In the so-called degenerate age of his times, when people had become weak and their body disordered, tea was considered the ideal medicine. Here you see very ancient copies of Kissa Yojoki. The one on the left is handwritten, and the other one is printed. As you see, it is written also in Chinese. It is considered bitter. As you see in red, that bitter is has effect on the heart. Now, I'll show you a few passages taken from Kissa Yojoki, which I translated recently. Tea is a mountain medicine appropriate for preserving health and used in order to prolong man's life. The places in the mountains and the valleys where it grows are considered sacred because their divine power manifests itself. The persons who take this medicine and drink it prolong their life. Both in China and in India, this plant is greatly esteemed. Also in our country, it is esteemed. It is a rare medicine both in antiquity and also now. It is a mountain medicine difficult to obtain. He says that the mountain, so it seems that Eisai is convinced that tea is grown on the mountains. It is necessary to go and pick it. Men in antiquity were as strong as gods, while now men are weak and delicate. Little by little, the 5 elements and the 5 organs have become as an old and rotten tree. Therefore, though people use acupuncture and moxa, they only manage to get wounds, and not even with thermal baths they can have improvement. When we take in great quantity the flavor that we like, only that particular organ is reinforced. And that organ will outpower the other organs, and this will cause the outbreak of diseases. So if, for example, we like the sweet flavor, then we give a lot of power to the organ related to sweetness. The 4 flavors, hot, sour, sweet, and salty, are normally taken with the meals, but the bitter flavor is not normally present, and therefore is not taken with the meals. As a consequence, the 4 organs, except the heart, are normally strong, and the heart is normally weak, and this often causes diseases. So in order to strengthen the heart, we should drink a lot of bitter taste and drink tea. The last one, what is called Uji tea, comes from the then monk Eisai of the temple Kenninji. He, in the 3rd year, let's say 1168, during the 4 months of summer, went to South China, and starting from Mingzhou, going to Mount Tiantai, passed through the tea mountain, and there he realized that people had in high esteem tea, and that tea had a very good effects as a medicine. When he came back to Japan that year, during autumn, in the 9th month by ship, he brought with him a certain number of tea seeds, and he sowed them in the province of Uji, the district of Kuze. Actually, the first tea grown in Japan, brought by Eisai, is said to have been planted on Mount Sefuri in the north part of Saga Prefecture, because coming from China, he landed in Kyushu, and so he had probably plenty of tea seeds and gave some just where he landed, and which was Sefuri. And they planted on Mount Sefuri. In the first cultivation is on Mount. That of by Myoe is on the mountains. It's always on the mountains. From seeds brought by Eisai when he landed in Kyushu, returning from his journey to China. Then he also gave seeds to the monk Myoe, as I told you. He planted the seeds in Togano, and when the seedlings were ready to be transplanted, Myoe chose Uji, which is a small city south of Kyoto, as the model region to grow tea trees and manufacture tea on a larger scale, which is not on the mountain, by the way. This is considered to be the beginning of Uji plantation of tea. Now, Uji is one of the most famous places for the cultivation of tea in Japan. It's a very famous tea, Uji tea. Eisai, after went to Kyoto, the capital, and they founded in 1202 the temple Kenninji, from where the cultivation of tea spread around the capital. This is Kenninji, you see here, which is still present exactly like that in Kyoto, in the city of Kyoto. It is the first Zen temple of Japan. And inside the garden of Kenninji, there's this still where it is eaten. This is the place where tea arrived in Kyoto, and from there it spread. During the late Kamakura period, that is between the last part of the 13th and the beginning of the following century, tea drinking had become rather common in the temples, and also among the highest strata of the population. In the same period, an entertainment using tea developed in Japan called tocha, or tea contest. It was present also in China from the Tang and Song periods. If I remember where somebody spoke about it this morning. It consisted in meetings called chayoriai, tea meetings, where the participants had to guess the origin of tea, tasting a certain number of different qualities. So this is also a Chinese custom or game which was introduced in Japan. The quality coming from Togano was considered the best and called honcha, real tea, and the others hicha, non-tea. Then also the tea from Uji, which was very good, began to be considered of high standard. Later, in the 14th century, a more refined form of tocha became popular. It was called Shishu Jipuku cha, and consisted in tasting 4 varieties of tea in 10 drinkings and guessing their origins. Besides tocha, also tea meetings with lavish decoration, large quantities of food and sake, and dancing were performed. This taste for the extravagant and the vulgar was known as basara, and was also the cause of some moral outrage. So in Japan, this tocha developed into very gorgeous meetings around tea, with importation of wonderful ware from China, paintings, and so very, very lavish. But it sometimes degenerated. So the word basara in Japanese is some kind of extravagance or something like that. In is also a Japanese restaurant called Basara, which is not bad. I often go there, by the way. I wonder if they really know the real meaning of Basara and the name of the restaurant. However, in the 15th century, thanks to a few great personalities, all of whom related to Zen Buddhism, tea drinking evolved from entertainment into a more serious and spiritual practice called Chanoyu, known in the West as tea ceremony, or Sado, the way of tea. Murata Juko, Takeno Jo, and the greatest tea master, Senno Rikyu, which everybody knows, I suppose, developed Wabi-cha, a very spiritual approach to tea. By the way, Murata Juko, Takeno Jo were Zen monks, and Senno Rikyu was very closely related to Zen. Eisai was a Zen monk, Gyoki was a Buddhist monk, and so on. So that is to say that the introduction of tea from China to Japan is very strictly related to Buddhism. From Tocha and Basara, a more elaborated and elegant practice of tea developed, which we call now Chanoyu. But this is another long history. This is a few images of how the tea ceremony is performed. You see here a lady with chaseng and making tea. These are the utensils used for the Chanoyu. And this is the tea made by matcha. You can see here the chaseng, and this is the preparation for drinking. Thank you very much. By the way, they use Eisai tea. They sell Eisai tea even today in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tollini, for his very insightful presentation.